Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne for the first time in 2022, so thank you for finding my channel. If you are new here, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without greenhouses, humidifiers, grow lights, etc, etc. They're either indoors or outdoors or they're out of the pool. If that is of any use, do hit subscribe. I post every week. And this week, ta-da! I am usually away and have the misfortune of missing this, but the flowering time this year has coincided with me coming back, and so I am able to show you in all its glory Dendrobium loddigesii. So what we're going to look at today is a little bit of an overview about the plant, basic care, and how to propagate it. Okie doke, so there we are. Just a bit of a recap. It is a Dendrobium loddigesii, and the name is interesting. I'm always fascinated by the history of the names of plants. So loddigesii, which this is named after, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, was a family of botanists and rare plant sellers in Hackney in London in the very late 18th, early 19th century. So this is very early in the orchid growing world of Europe, I must say. And this plant was in their collection in the 1830s under a different name, and it was eventually named correctly in 1887. But the loddigesii refers to this family of botanists, and they actually produced a beautiful volume of coloured engravings of all the rare and wonderful plants that they had at the time, which were also for sale. So it's kind of like a very expensive, very glamorous catalogue. But interesting that nothing really changes, does it? You still have people who specialise in the rare and the unusual now as you did in 1833. Anyway, Conrad Loddigesii, if that's how you pronounce it, and his son George are forever remembered in the name of this beautiful little orchid. First thing to know then, this is a species orchid, so it is as it is found in the wild. And I'll put the link below to orchidspecies.com, which is a great resource for finding out where your orchid species came from and what its best care conditions are. And what you will find there is that this orchid is a native of reasonably high altitude area that spans China, Vietnam, Laos, that sort of band of mountainous country. And it is pretty versatile. It is described as epiphytic, lithophytic, and terrestrial, which essentially means it will grow wherever it can find a nook. I think the important thing to realize too, though, with an orchid like this is when it is described as terrestrial, it isn't terrestrial in the sense of a perennial herbaceous plant with roots, yada, yada, yada. What this would most likely do is be growing on the ground, but more than likely on rock or on a mossy mound or something. Its roots are never going to penetrate deeply. It will be more of an opportunistic clumper in the right conditions. So although it is described as terrestrial, you wouldn't want to pot it as you would a regular terrestrial plant. We know where it comes from, so high altitude, which means it can take relatively cool temperatures. So it's described as a cool to warm grower, and I keep this baby outdoors all year. Outdoors for me means it is under cover from the rain, so it's protected from rain, but it does get the cold winter minimums in Melbourne, which can get down to between 1 to 5 degrees Celsius, which is, what is that? That's about around the 40-ish degree mark Fahrenheit. So chilly, but not freezing. And this one, as you can see, thrives. And with lots of dendrobiums, the key to this particular one as well is that cool winter rest period. So what it needs in winter, as many nobile type dendrobiums will, is that cool seasonal differentiation, as well as a rest period. So very little or no water and certainly no feeding for the cold winter months. It will then produce flower buds sort of in spring, and then the flowers open for me here in Australia usually around the Christmas week period, which is kind of early-ish summer. So it's a little bit later than the other nobile type dendrobiums that I have. And it's often why I miss it, because if I'm away and if it gets particularly hot, the flowers won't last as long as if the weather's a bit cooler. But at the moment it's actually quite cool here in Melbourne, so the flowers are lasting well. And they are described as long lasting, but as I said, if it gets particularly hot, then the flowers just don't seem to last as long. The other thing that this will need in its cool winter rest is quite good sunlight. Where I have it, it gets morning sun, direct sun early in the morning, and then it has filtered light for the rest of the day. And then as the season moves, it gets less morning sun and more general filtered dappled light. So that is what is going on with this baby for me. Temperature wise then, as I said, for me, it can go from our winter conditions here in Melbourne through to summer, which can be quite hot. So in winter, this orchid can take temperatures that are pretty close to 0 degrees centigrade. It sometimes gets to usually 1 or 2 degrees centigrade outdoors at night, which is about 34, 35, 36 Fahrenheit. It's fine as long as it's dry. It will survive those temperatures, and then it can go up. In Melbourne, we sometimes get quite extreme heat in summer, but it doesn't last very long. That can be the high 30s, which is around the 100 degrees Fahrenheit range. It's tough because it grows in such a variety of environments, and it grows at various altitudes. It can take hot temperatures and it can take cool temperatures. The only thing to remember is in winter, keep it dry if you're going to get cold temperatures. When the season warms up, when spring starts to happen, you resume your watering normally and liquid fertilizing. I always dilute my liquid fertilizers by at least down to 1/8 of the recommended dose. And it could be anything orchid specific. A mix that's about flower promotion, a mix that is more general health, or I also just use a seaweed based solution diluted and give it a good tonic. And I do try to do that about once a month in the growing season. So that is from spring all the way through to autumn until the weather cools down, and then really stop fertilizing. I just can't not water my orchids in winter. And winter in Melbourne is quite long. I refrain from really drenching it, but I certainly missed it on a sunny winter's morning, and occasionally, maybe once a month, give it a very light watering again on a sunny winter's morn. Because what you don't want is it to be both cool and damp, because that can spell death and disaster for your roots. The other thing I wanted to talk about in relation to this plant is its growth habit. Now, it is described as a miniature to small orchid, which I think is fair enough. As you can see, it is not that big. I've had this orchid for maybe 3 years now, and it certainly grows like the clappers, but it's not a massively tall plant. So actually, it's a really great one for indoor cultivation because it's never going to take up much space. Now, because it's quite opportunistic, you can certainly grow it in terracotta, as I have done, but it also works beautifully hung if you've got the kind of growing conditions where you can grow things in baskets or mounted. It looks amazing because of its growth habit. So I'll come in and show you closer, but you can actually see that it is a tangle of keikis as well as new growths. Now, when I first had this and didn't really know that much about it, I was really worried about the keiki production, which is constant and all over it. So I was assiduously pulling off the keikis and potting them up or shoving them back into the mix, thinking, oh, I'm not doing this right. Because generally, if a Dendrobium type orchid is producing keikis, it's getting too much water, too much nutrient, perhaps not enough light at the right time of year. So I thought, oh, I'm just doing this wrong. And then I started to look at some images of beautiful mature specimens, which are this tangled ball of fabulousness, and realizing that the keiki production is just part of its growth habit, that it is one of those orchids that produces keikis, and it is not a negative. So it will flower from the keiki still on the stem, and it just assists it in producing this tangled, dense bundle of orchid. And if I were to pull off all the keikis, there wouldn't be a lot left, which is what I did the first year, Q Exhibit A, and I just shoved them all in another pot because I thought that's the right thing to do. And as you can perhaps see, I'll come in and show you that these keikis have all taken off, and I've got multiple little plants in there doing well. But I shall not do this again. What I will do is just allow the orchid to grow in its merry way, forming this clump of fabulousness. The other thing, it has semi-deciduous habits, so the older canes lose a lot of their leaves, but not all of them, so it's not like one of those bare cane dendrobiums that you often see. And in this case, it is flowering from last year's new growth, but that doesn't mean I'm going to trim off any of the old canes, obviously, because it won't rebloom from the exact same node that it's flowered from, but that cane could rebloom in a different spot where it hasn't flowered before. So again, like with most dendrobiums, don't trim any canes unless they're really desiccated, dry, and have nothing left to give. The flowers, as you can see, are the most beautiful color. This pale pink and then an almost white pink with this incredible kind of egg yolk yellow heart to the lip. It's just stunning. And there is a very light, sort of slightly lemony fragrance, which is beautiful. Obviously, the more of a specimen you get, the more blooms you'll have, the more the scent will be pervasive. But it's really very elegant. And I have to say, plant lovers, this is a tough orchid. Now, I bought this Exhibit B in one of these little plastic tubes from a hardware store here in Australia. And if you're Australian, you'll know what I mean, Bunnings. But I think you can basically get the same kind of things in Europe and North America. They're little orchid polypacks, and you usually get a little small black plastic pot with the little seedling in. So once the seedlings have been grown on from a flask, they're individually potted, popped in these and sold. Now, as we know with seedlings, it can take years for them to become anything, or not, as the case may be. So this I bought in one of these little poly packs when I knew nothing about orchids. This is a species orchid, and in Australia, not that easy to come by, and I have not seen it for sale since. So it was really quite fortuitous. So don't discount buying these, because certainly in Australia, you can actually find some quite rare and unusual orchids that are in these packs. All you need, plant lovers, is patience. And then let's just talk about potting. As you can see, it's in terracotta, because I am, as we all know, a terracotta pot kind of guy. The thing is with this, it's a small orchid, so it needs to be in the smallest pot you can find. If anything, I would say this is over potted still. This is the pot that I planted it in when I first got it 3 years ago. It's flowering and it's doing well, but I would probably, if I had my time again, pot it into a smaller pot. Right now though, I'm not going to bother repotting it. I'm just going to let it fill this pot till its heart content. But you can see, when I didn't know anything about orchids and I potted up the keikis, this pot is way too big. What I might actually do is just pot these down a size now actually, and deal with that, because the pot is too big. But these little keikis, each one has actually grown and sent up new growth, so it is amazing. So try and pot it as small as you can. Because it's such an opportunistic orchid, I think you can basically go with any type of potting that works for you depending on your environment. I can't do baskets generally because of my growing conditions, and I can't have baskets indoors, but I could actually grow this in a basket outdoors and just hang it under a tree, because that would be its perfect conditions, as long as you can protect it from winter rain. But like me, if you're going to grow it in a pot, then pretty generic Dendrobium mix, which is a light bark with a little bit of sphagnum moss, which I have got in here, a little bit of charcoal, a little bit of perlite, and mycorrhizal fungi, and a couple of grains of a slow release fertilizer. In the mix, not too many, literally 1 or 2 little balls. And then fertilizing wise, I would then add another topical application of a couple of slow release fertilizer balls at the beginning, very kind of early on in spring. And then, as I mentioned, maybe every 3 to 4 weeks, I give it a nice feed of a liquid-based fertilizer, which could be anything. And really, it does grow like the clappers in spring and summer, so you do need to make sure that you're keeping it moist and optimally fertilized without going crazy, because this is the time when you're going to get lots of new growth, and it's those that are going to mature and flower for you. So, plant lovers, from Dendrobium loddigesii and I, welcome to 2022. Things can only get better, as the song went, and I look forward to seeing you next week with another orchidy adventure. Until then, take care. See you next week.